Good afternoon and welcome to Special Collections. I'm so thrilled to see such a big crowd here. My name is Catherine Ecker. I am the interim director here in Special Collections. I'm also the head of research and instruction. I just want to go over very quickly some guidelines for handling the materials because I very much hope that you will have an opportunity to look through the items when Eric is done speaking. And I just want to point out to those people who are on Zoom that Special Collections is open to the public and anyone can come here. And if you see things today that interest you, I welcome you to come and visit us and look at materials in our reading room. All right, so materials that are in foam cradles, these black foams here, they need to stay in the cradles. Those support the bindings and prevent any damage. So as you look through them, you can page through them carefully. Just remove these book weights and you can look through them. With the illuminated manuscript at the end of the table there, I'll ask that you not touch any of the text or illustrations. The folders that are on the table, you're welcome to look through them, page through them in the same way you would page through a book to maintain the order. And with the photographs, I'm going to ask that we just look through the ones that are displayed now, because otherwise we'd have to issue everybody with gloves if they wanted to look through more photos. So I just ask you to take care, go slow, and enjoy the materiality of the text. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So welcome to all of you in the room, and to those of you joining us online for this session. Welcome to everyone to the Hanna Holborn Gray Special Collections Research Center in the Regenstein Library. Now, this is one of my favorite spaces to teach in and to do research in. I think of it as a laboratory for the humanities, and it's not just a library, and it's one of many arts and humanities labs that I hope those of you who are on campus with us today will have a chance to explore. We now have amazing teaching spaces at the Logan Center for the Arts, the Smart Museum, including the Feitler Center for Academic Inquiry, and the Weston Games Lab in the Media Arts and Design space on the first floor of Currar Library. And I know all of these spaces are open to you today. This is an incredibly exciting place to introduce students to the history, theory, and practice of both the arts and the humanities. I've routinely taught courses here in Special Collections over the years, but always specialized courses for advanced undergraduates and for graduate students especially, part of their training in archival research methods. I'm a specialist in early American history and culture, and I teach a course on the history of the book in America for graduate students in the smaller seminar room that you've just passed on your way in here. I also teach a course on the Declaration of Independence for students in the departments of English, Fundamentals, Issues and Texts, History, Human Rights, and Law, Letters, and Society right here in this wonderful classroom. 2 years ago, though, I made the decision, with the help and blessing of the wonderful librarians here, to offer my Humanities Core course, Human Being and Citizen, here for the first time, allowing first-year students in their autumn quarter, just as they're transitioning here, the chance to experience some of the most amazing materials in our collections. Doing so was transformative. I think it began to help students see a little better what it is that humanists actually do. The kinds of issues and topics they confront, the questions they ask, the materials and people they explore. It allowed this group of students, 18 of them, a chance to consider the longer histories of the ways in which the very texts they were then reading had come into being, had reached their first readers, and to begin to wonder about what those readers might have made of them. I think it changes your experience of, say, the work of Homer to be able to see the media shifts from an ancient papyrus fragment to a first printing from movable type in the 15th century, to the various printed translations that have been made of the text ever since. But it was also transformative for me. Working with the materials in Special Collections gave me, and by extension the students, a glimpse at the different ways in which the texts we were reading had been appreciated and interpreted, studied and taught and fought over here over the years at our university. And so in learning about those modern texts that they were reading, the copies that they had gotten from the university bookstore, the seminary co-op, and as well as the older texts around the tables, we were also learning things about what has made our university such a unique place in both the humanities and in higher education since its founding in 1890. So I'm here today to report on that experience and to share some of what my students and I learned together. But let's begin first with a classic Chicago question. What is the core for? This is the kind of Chicago-style question that might be the subject of a philosophical debate among the attendees of a Night Owls meeting, the kind of debate that begins around 9 p.m., and goes later into the night over at Ida Noyes. Or it might be the kind of question that you would see in a forum in the pages of The Point, a magazine edited and in part written by University of Chicago alumni. Our college communications team has been highlighting this question over the past few years to explore the aims, means, and ends of the core. Asking fundamental questions about how and why we do what we do is a kind of second nature to those of us at Chicago. But what counts as a fundamental question, or a Chicago-style question, has changed over time, just as what counts as the core has changed. What is the core? Why do we have it? What should students get out of it? How should it be taught? What is it for? In other words, why do it? But we also have some other questions to address today, because we're talking not generally about the core, but specifically about the humanities core. And so I ask, what is the humanities core? How did it come to be? How has it changed over time? And perhaps most significantly, why is it foundational to the university's educational mission? That is, why do we want the humanities core to be the one experience that all of our incoming first-year students and transfer students share in common? Now, I'm not just a teacher in the core. As the deputy dean and collegiate master in the humanities, I also oversee it. And as an administrator over the past few years, I have come to learn at heart that the core is a challenge. We have over 100 sections of the humanities core running right now. It's an administrative and logistical challenge to staff the core with the right faculty and instructors and to provide the right mix of sequences so that students get their top choices. It's a big operation, a collaboration between multiple units, multiple departments, multiple instructors on multiple staffs, and it's a big financial challenge. It's expensive to do this. I won't say how much, in part because I'm not even sure. I'm not even sure anyone knows exactly how much it costs besides our colleagues in the provost's office. But I think you can imagine that dividing our incoming class into 19-person sections of the humanities core to promote good discussions and to let them learn how to be socialized here in our academic community is an expensive proposition. It would be much cheaper to do what we once did in the humanities core. Assemble everyone in Mandel Hall, have a series of rotating specialists lecture at them, not really to them, at them, and then give a multiple choice exam at the end of the year. There they are sitting it. Yes, we did that. And versions of that model still exist for introductory courses in the humanities at some of our peers. But beginning in the 1930s, and especially since the late 1960s, we've been committed to a different delivery model for our classes in the humanities core, small group discussions directed by faculty and instructors. And now, thanks to some generous donors, we are able to offer enhancements to the core. Teaching, for instance, in the Smart Museum with special exhibits, or collaborations with the Court Theater so that our students can see the newest productions of classic texts and get to engage with the production staff, the directors and the performers. And then, of course, the room that you're currently in, the special collections in the library. These wonderful new programs are challenges in their own. They're challenges to curate, they're challenges to work into syllabi, they're challenges to execute, but they are some of the most exciting things happening, I think, in the humanities core right now, and students love them. The core is now the name for all the general education classes, from the arts and humanities core to the social sciences core, or SOC, to the core in biology, core bio, to Phi-Sci core and physical sciences. This wonderful graphic, which we've come to think of as a kind of bingo card, helps our students make sense of it. The core curriculum is a magnet into our college for high school students who are looking for a broad and general education and a foundation in all areas, in addition to an academic specialization. It really does attract students into the college. And alumni often recall the Core as a key component of their time at Chicago, no matter what major they chose or professions they ended up pursuing. Sometimes alumni recall with great specificity the texts they read in the Humanities Core. More often, what they recall are the ideas that were debated or the way certain teachers helped them develop their own abilities to read and write and ask questions of complex texts. In fact, I had an alum who graduated in the early 1970s write to me late last year, hoping I might be able to put my hands on the syllabus for the Humanities Core course he had taken in 1968. He remembered, as it turned out, most of the text, but he wanted the full list because now that he had retired, he wanted to reread everything. I wasn't able to produce that list, unfortunately, but I was able to fish from our archives some of the books that he would have used. This was one of them. Now, still, the administrative and financial challenge of the Core is nothing compared with the educational challenge. The challenge of what a Core is meant to counter and of actually teaching and learning in its spaces. The Core is an educational challenge. We know this. This is one reason why the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, floated the idea in January 2023, just last year, that all Florida college students should have a required core that would emphasize Western civilization and especially liberty. But our core is not like that. We do not have a unitary core the way one of our peers, Columbia University, does, really the first to introduce a core curriculum. I think you can really see the contrast here. I invite you to watch these videos between the videos that our institutions, both with Common Cores, use to promote that curriculum to potential applicants on YouTube. On the left, you see an admissions officer from Columbia explaining what to expect from the core. And on the right, you see two of our own students talking about their own experience and pathways through the core, which involve taking different humanities sequence, different social science sequence, different languages, different mathematics courses, and so on and so forth. So there is no one pathway through the core, and often, there are as many pathways through the core as there are first-year students. So we do not have anything like the unitary core that Columbia does. Columbia's Humanities Core, which is called Literature Humanities, is something that all students take. And so all students are reading the Iliad at the same time in, by the way, a translation produced by our press in the 1950s. There it is, Richmond Lattimore's Iliad. And in fact, we have correspondence in our archives here. We have the press archives from the University of Chicago and correspondence between people overseeing the core at Columbia and our press from the 1950s, asking us, desperately begging us to produce a paperback version of the Iliad, and promising that if we did and priced it at the right amount, they would adopt it every year. And more or less, they have kept that promise over 70 years. So our core is different than Columbia's, but it is also different from some other cores that peers have recently embraced or re-embraced. It is not, for instance, like the newly designed course at Stanford on civic, liberal, and global education, which is known on that campus just as college by its CLGE acronym, which requires all first students to engage a common set of readings. And by the way, we also supply text for students there. One of the optional readings is our own Chicago Principles, the Statement on Freedom of Expression. Our core in the humanities is flexible and changing. We currently have 8 sequences to offer our new students. As you'll see, the one I taught dates from 1977, Human Being and Citizen, and I'm going to be talking to you about in a little bit. It has changed since then in both structural and in intellectual ways, and I'll talk about that too, but it retains the same title. The idea of a core sequence or variance dates to the late 1960s. But we have none of those courses that were offered in the late 60s now, and we have a number of courses that have been rolled out much more recently, as you see on the bottom there after the year 2000. It is important to note that students in these sequences range across chronologies and geographies in each one, so that a snapshot like this one, taken in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the core that is, gives you a sense of the great diversity of texts in the modern humanities core. Indeed, when a reporter from The Hill wrote me to discuss the core in light of Governor DeSantis's remarks, I simply pointed out that in week 4 of our humanities winter core sequence, students were reading a variety of texts. Students in our core course Media Aesthetics were reading Plato's Phaedrus. Students in Human Being and Citizen were transitioning from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics to Augustine's Confessions. Students in Philosophical Perspectives were reading Descartes. Students in Greece and Rome were discussing Hamlet. But students in Reading Cultures were moving from Homer to Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And students in Readings in World Literature were reading The Pillow Book, written by Shei Shonagon, a court lady to a Japanese empress, composed about the year 1000. Students in our newer Poetry in the Human course were reading works by contemporary poets from the Middle East, and students in Language and the Human were reading Richard Rodriguez's Hunger of Memory and discussing issues of bilingual education. Starting in the 1970s, the college catalog informed prospective students that these courses were not great books courses and not surveys of Western literature. This is not what we have been doing here for the last 50 years. Now, this is not really what the reporter wanted to hear. But the variety of what students are reading in the middle of the year in the Humanities Core is characteristic of our general approach to the core and to the fact that we are inviting students to choose from 8 different sequences. And from arts cores offered in at least 7 different programs and departments, some of which involve the study of the arts and others the practice of it, and from over 50 different languages. Each sequence has a set of common texts set by the instructors collectively, and only by the instructors. No administrator like me could insist that this or that text be included on the Humanities Core. And it is crucial to say that the same text, common in 2 different sections of the Humanities Core, may be engaged differently, depending on what the students and the instructors bring to it. Inevitably, that same text then in different sequences, 2 different sequences, will engender different kinds of conversations. I used to think that a student couldn't make it through the college without confronting the pleasures and puzzles of Plato's Republic. Right now, students are reading it in different ways in 2 Humanities Core sequences and 1 Soc Core sequence, with the option of taking advanced courses on that cornerstone text about education in courses in philosophy, in classics, and in political science. The history of core requirements at research universities like ours is a history of educational challenges to academic and disciplinary specialization. This was certainly how I perceived it when I started here over 2 decades ago. When I arrived on campus, I was as laser-focused as any recent PhD student could be. I had spent my past 3 years writing a dissertation on the cultural origins of the US Constitution. And to do so, I read everything printed in the year 1787. I was a specialist in that year and in that text. But I felt like I could manage to teach other texts that had been written, say, a dozen or so years in either direction. That was no small brag, I thought. There's a massive historical literature on the American Revolution in the last quarter of the 18th century, and I felt like I had devoted time to learning it. That my graduate program had expended money to train me in this probably hadn't crossed my mind, but again, that would have been expensive. I thought I would spend my career teaching courses in the late 18th century. The master at the time, the person who had the job that I now have, suggested, though, that I teach the newest Humanities Core sequence at the time, Media Aesthetics, and teach Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Poetics alongside W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, and the film stills of Cindy Sherman, the contemporary artist. And so I protested. The closest thing chronologically to my specialty on that syllabus was Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. But I think there's a wide gulf between the subtleties and truths universally acknowledged there and the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, or the subtleties of James Madison's Federalist 10. Surely we have specialists, I asked, who would be better at this. And the then master told me, well, we all stretch. And I did it. I fought against that generalist approach, and when I was offered the chance to teach in American Civ, the American civilization, the first quarter, 1500 to 1800, corresponding to my expertise, I jumped. I defected. I knew the secondary literature, but in a way I found that I was actually not a better teacher in that course than I was in my media aesthetics course. In fact, I was kind of worse. I knew the secondary literature to a point where I didn't share the curiosity and firsthand experiences my students were displaying for me every meeting. And I was centering discussions not around their questions, but around my own expertise. And that is a no-no in the core classroom. In truth, the core doesn't teach content, which is why we tolerate so many and such different humanities cores. It teaches habits of mind, approaches, disciplinary orientations rather than disciplines per se. The Humanities Core introduces students to some primary texts, and the texts change from year to year. But more so, it introduces them to the task of interpreting those texts, and especially of confronting them as an academic community together. These are the spaces where students get to see how a philosopher asks a question or reconstructs someone else's argument, how an artist or an art historian looks at an image, how a literary scholar or a poet interprets a particular line, word, or phrase, and how a historian develops a context for understanding a document or an event. Insofar as they do that, they represent probably the most important responsibility that any of us in the Faculty of the Humanities have. Now, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the course that I taught, so I'm going to see if this works as I walk and talk about some of the items around the table that you've been invited to look at. We have first here this wonderful bound edition of the Pennsylvania Packet displaying the first day's public printing of the Constitution. This is the world that I came out of. And the rest of the text around the table frightened me. I didn't think I had any business teaching them, and I couldn't imagine how I would teach them. And so the way in which I negotiated my anxiety when I came and I could no longer avoid teaching the Humanities Core, I defected back from the American Civ, was to bring the course inside special collections, which I felt would give me enough props to work with, but that would also help me understand a little bit about the nature of this university. So what we did, these were the texts that were on the list in 2022, which is when I taught the course here for the first time in special collections. The readings have actually changed since then, but I'm giving you a snapshot and a kind of report on what happened here 2 years ago. But that was the reading list for the first quarter of Human Being and Citizen. Now, some of you may know that this is a course that is named after a question that Socrates asks in the Apology. Who is a knower of such excellence of a human being and a citizen? In other words, there are certain professions where we know something, and there are other professions where we don't, right? And who knows what is the excellence of being a human or a citizen, right? That's what Plato asks. And so one of the first things that my students and I did together was to look at other translations of that text. Is there anyone who understands human and political virtue? That was the first translation into English in 1871. Who understands those good qualities which belong to the man and the citizen? That was Ellen Mason, the first female translator of Plato in Boston in 1878. Who has knowledge of that kind of excellence, that of a man and a citizen? This is the translation we were using. Who is an expert in this kind of excellence, the human and social kind? And so on and so on. To begin to understand that what they were getting was a particular viewpoint of the text, a particular translation at a particular moment, and that they would get a chance to think about this text over time, not just in 2022. I introduced them to some of the architects of the course that they were taking. Faculty members from the 1970s, many of whom, 5 out of 6 of the first instructors in this Humanities Core sequence, had actually been college students here themselves. So we've got Amy Cass, Leon Cass, Herman Sinaiko, Ralph Lerner, and Marvin Mirsky. And they designed this. I let my students watch a YouTube clip of the Casses back in 2014, now 10 years ago. Amy has sadly passed away. talking with Bill Crystal about the origins of the course. And it was designed to be a course that brought together instructors from the humanities, that was the human being part, and the social sciences, that was the citizen part. And so the Plato text translation was a good hook for both of those. We looked, I found something in my office in the college, the master's office, which was the description of human being and citizen from the very first year it was offered. And so that's the second document that's on the table here. This is one of my favorite lines from this inaugural year, where the instructors write that the course aims to liberate the student from a thoughtless adherence to unexamined opinions and for the more careful consideration of his or her life as human being and citizen. It also aims to cultivate the liberating skills of careful reading, speaking, listening, and writing. Through discussion and writing, the student will have an opportunity to learn, to understand, and then to compare and criticize divergent thoughts of different authors dealing with a common theme. That was how this course was understood. And I think that language of liberation is a really interesting language that they were playing with in the 1970s as they got this course off the ground. We're lucky to have some of the original materials from the origins of this course. These came out of the office of Ralph Lerner, one of the original instructors, really last summer as he was moving out of his office in the Harper Tower. And it gives you a sense of how this syllabus has evolved over time. And so originally the idea was that students would sign up for a conjoined or concurrent humanities and social science sequence, and they would be able to do basically not 3 hours of human being and citizen a week, but 6 hours of human being and citizen a week with 2 different instructors meeting up to discuss some texts that they had in common, but doing on the humanities side typically Plato through Tolstoy, and on the social science side, typically Plato through Marx or Tocqueville or something like that. This was a conjunction that operated for some years. We also are lucky to have some of the original assignments from this course, some of which were quite creative, where they were inviting students to make a dialogue. You know, you've read dialogues. It's obviously shocking, it doesn't take a lot of thought to realize that we ask students to write essays that are of a different kind than the things that they're actually reading. There's a way in which an essay prompt like this, which is inviting them to mimic what they've been reading, the Platonic dialogues, is kind of wonderful. They also used, and this I think is terrifying, I mentioned this to my students, they used oral exams at the end. So, you've read these 5 books, come prepared to talk about this list of, 40 topics? Yeah. I have to say at a faculty meeting, there were, especially in late 2022, as ChatGPT began to circulate and we started to see, in the news, all of these discussions about how no one was ever going to write anything again. A number of faculty thought, well, maybe, oral exam doesn't sound so bad, you can try to reintroduce that. Students also got to see this front page news. There was a divorce between the 2 sections of human being and citizen. And in 1983, we've got the Chicago Maroon out here on the table. In 1983, the SSCD, the Social Science Collegiate Division, decided to sunset their half of human being and citizen. Ultimately, it became something that we call classics of social and political thought, and it's not exactly conjoined, but many of the texts are texts that did exist on the syllabus. This is a wonderful, those of you who are in the room, please, and actually you can look online, the campus publications are all digitized, but this thing that says the greatest story ever told is an editorial by David Brooks, who you may know, about William F. Buckley, who was visiting. You can see the news that the Human Being and Citizen has been canceled is the front at the top, and then William Buckley's visit is a little lower down. Nevertheless, there were students in the Humanities Core, first-year students, who wrote in its defense. And I think I looked, one of the students I looked up some of these folks, and several of them became academics. So this is the very first book we were reading together, Plato's Symposium. Really the first book these students were reading in the humanities in college. A lot of high school students are not reading philosophy, so it's going to be a new kind of experience. So I decided I would ease them into this, and I would show them one of the very first books that entered our library. And that's this book on the table, which is Henri Estienne's 1578 edition of the works of Plato. And it was one of the first books acquired by our library. I should say we were also reading the Declaration of Independence. This same edition, the 1578 edition, was the one that both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson ultimately owned, 2 centuries after its publication. So we got it in the 1890s when it was 300 and some years old. They were getting it when it was 200 and some years old. That tells you something about the kind of value attached to this particular edition. So those survive. Adams' copy is at the Boston Public Library, and Jefferson's is at the Library of Congress. The story here, and I think it's a really wonderful and telling one about the history of our university, is that the idea of the University of Chicago was that we would create a German-style research university. And so it was only natural that we would send the inaugural president, William Rainey Harper, in 1890 or 1891, to Berlin. So he could sort of see how a German university was run, and so he could maybe recruit some of the faculty, raid some of the faculty. The story goes that he walked into an academic bookstore and that was going out of business, and he was offered the contents of the bookstore. And he thought this was amazing because there were every German dissertation, these little 5-page dissertations in all disciplines from the 19th century, plus highlights in the history of science and philology and classics and history in all fields, really top-notch items. So he came back and he mentioned this to the early trustees, who kind of rolled their eyes and said, well, you don't have any students yet at the University of Chicago, and you don't have any buildings. So how much is it going to cost? He said $45,000. And he said, well, for $45,000, we could build Cobb, right? Wouldn't you rather have a classroom building? Or we could build Gates Blake, and then you could have a place where people could sleep, like a dorm, right? We don't have a library. What are you going to do with a library? They did a special assessment on the trustees. You see the names. You've seen the names on the buildings, Ryerson and Hutchinson and McCormick and so forth. And they raised that money. Harper himself gave some of that money. And they must have had somebody very good in the president's office, in the communications team, because they made the New York Times, the front page of the New York Times, where the acquisition of that, what was said to be 280,000 volumes and 120,000 dissertations, was described as one of the largest book deals ever consummated. It also allowed us, before we had really any students or hardly any faculty, to brag that we had the 5th largest research library in the United States, right? Within a few years, within 5 years, we had doubled that and had the 2nd largest research library, which is not bad given how new the university was compared to universities that, say, had started in the 1630s or the 1680s or the 1720s. Yes, it turns out that there was some discrepancy between what a volume was, and so one of the first things that I think our legal team did was to negotiate a lower price because there was this discrepancy about what a volume was. So the works of Plato that was one work, but it was in 3 volumes, so what was that? So in any case, we worked it out. As we were, and I should say, and I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, that one of the really great things about showing students this edition is that Henri Estienne went by the Latin name Stephanus. And every reader of Plato has probably been annoyed by the running numbers and letters that appear in the Platonic dialogues, and that you were told as a student that you will need to cite that number as well as the page number. So the phrase human being and citizen is always 20b. That's the universal line number. It's called the Stephanus number. And the reason we cite human being and citizen as 20b is because it appeared on page 20, about 20% of the way down the page, 20b. And so this text that entered our library in the 1890s and that was printed in the 1570s is still something they're going to have to deal with, right? That common line numbering is still going to be something that's going to affect how they do their papers. So I realize that we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the other things I might skip over. Well, no, this is such a wonderful story. Mortimer Adler, who joined the university in the 1930s, was one of the real architects of the original core and of the discussion style core. We have his archives. He wrote a kind of bestseller at the time. It's now sold over 500,000 copies, called How to Read a Book. And it was really part of a movement, not for people at universities, but for people outside of universities who had a kind of vocational training and wanted the compensatory value of engaging with these what were called great books. And Adler was very happy to supply them. So he appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1952 to celebrate the release of the Great Books of the Western World, which was published by Encyclopedia Britannica. The first 2 volumes are called a Syntopicon, but otherwise the rest, you've only got 20 volumes here, are classic works, often in very cheap public domain reprints. So they weren't always the best text or the text that our students were reading. And this was part of a movement in that period to embrace the great books, to engage them in different kinds of conversations. So here's a box set of those great books that has a number of the books that our students were still reading in 2022, including Plato's Apology and the Declaration of Independence. Gosh. There's Adler in his study. He believed that there were 102 great ideas and that those 52 volumes of the great books could be divided into those 102 categories, and that he would provide, through his Syntopicon, which is a word he coined, a guidebook through the ideas. And Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was the president at the time, said, yeah, so my friends are interested in like sex and money. Are those some of the great ideas? And he was told, no. There are some other wonderful things in the papers. So students were also introduced to some of the ways in which the books that they were read had been taught over time at our university. And so one of the things we discovered was a file of papers from Leo Strauss, the prominent political philosopher who taught here from 49 to 69. In 1959, he taught a course on Plato's Symposium, the very book that they were reading. They got to look at his lecture notes on this course, but even better, they got to look at his notebook, the notebook that he used to make notes about what he read. And so on the second day, so on the first day they got to see this book, on the second day they got to see an example of how a prominent academic in the 1950s made notes, how he absorbed and metabolized the text so that he could teach it, right? Stephanus number by Stephanus number, in his very, very tiny and hard to read. He wrote in pencil too, as they would have to do in the class. They also got to meet Alan Bloom, who had been a student of Leo Strauss, but who had a very different interpretation of the symposium. For instance, he thought that most of the details that Strauss cared about, the fact that you had to know something about Athenian politics to know who Alcibiades was. He thought those were all very relativist concerns, not the kinds of things you needed to know in order to understand Plato, which gives you a sense of difference in approach, even from one prominent teacher to another prominent student. We read the Iliad in Carolyn Alexander's translation, and we were very lucky here to have this amazing collection of Plato material, of Homer materials, including papyrus manuscripts. The papyrus manuscript that's out on the table was collected by an early faculty member named Edgar Goodspeed, who was one of the people to translate the Bible. We did a whole Bible translation in the early 20th century, and were able to get copies of that Bible into hotel rooms. It's quite a coup. And you are welcome, those of you who are in the room, to leave with a copy of this catalog called Homer in Print. This is the catalog of the collection of M.C. Lang, who was not a student at our university, but who donated this collection. He had gone to Hamilton College in New York, and he had worked with somebody who had been a student at the university. So he was a student of one of our students, and he had learned from that professor that this would be a good place, a place that would really, where those Homer books that he had collected over his lifetime would get a lot of use. And frankly, they get a lot of use. They've been almost in continuous display, and Catherine and others regularly put up a display called Homer from Papyrus to Pop-Up Book, where the entire room is Homer. So we've just got a little bit of Homer here. But I had students, international students, who could read Russian, who could read Spanish, who could read Chinese, and we have the first translations in all of those languages. So I had a student from Latvia who could read Russian, and so the Moscow 1776 edition is out there. I'll skip over. As I said, we read Carolyn Alexander's copy of the translation of Homer's Iliad, which was the first translation into English by a woman. And it was done in 2016, so less than 10 years ago. There's since been another translation, I'm sorry, this is so glitchy, by Emily Wilson that came out last year that many of you may know of. But my students got to see the first translation by a woman, which was into French by Anne Dacier. Here in her 1699 translation, so 317 years before the first translation by a woman into English, and that's sitting out right here. So I'm conscious of some issues around time, so maybe the best thing is to open it up for some questions. But I can tell you around the table, you've got also wonderful items related to Genesis, to Antigone, to the Declaration of Independence, and to the visit by Martin Luther King in 1966 of when he spoke at Mandel Hall. Happy to keep talking, but also want to let people have their time to ask questions. It's very unusual to do anything about the core where I'm lecturing the whole time.
Do you have like an archive list of the different years and the syllabi?
We don't. We unfortunately don't. We have that snapshot from 1980-81, and then we have more recent things. But when the alumni wrote to me and said, I'd love to have my core syllabus from 1968, I had to write back that unfortunately I was able to figure out where he had lived, we have that records, where that course had met in Cobb, but not the syllabus, because we just didn't keep curricular things like that at the time, even though things were changing. So 10 years before, there would have been a common syllabus that everyone used. But after 1966, everything changed, and so it's to our shame that we didn't keep that. But there are still opportunities sometimes to get files like that. The Leon and Amy Cass papers have not been processed, so I'm hopeful there are some things in there. Yes.
To go back to this,
yeah.
And say whatever you were going to say.
Yes, unfortunately, this book is not out on the table. But one of the issues in Human Being and Citizen that comes up constantly is that in this particular iteration in 2022-23, there were no female authors on the syllabus until the third quarter, at which point there were mostly female authors. So they read Kant, but then they read Hannah Arendt, and they read Toni Morrison. And so one way that I and my students tried to think about this was to really mark the ways in which different female faculty here and different female students had engaged with these works. And so, as some of you may know, Simone Weil was a philosopher, and in France, in the 1940s, after the fall of France, she published a short article called The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, which is one of the seminal contributions to the study of Homer across the 20th century, just really one of the most important. It was translated into English in the 50s by Mary McCarthy, and then it appeared just as the Vietnam War was beginning to see mobilization in 1965. It appeared in the pages of the Chicago Review, which was one of the campus publications, with simply a note that said it is timely as now as it was when it first appeared. So these were students who were engaging with Weil's thought in 1965, thinking about Vietnam, but also thinking about what war does to people's sensibilities, which is really what that essay is largely about blunting one's sense of humanity. And so, being able to pull out things like that for students so that they can see a kind of tradition of female, let's say, engagement with these texts, I thought was really, really important. So I tried to do that in other ways too. We had let's see, you're missing all the Genesis stuff, but Wendy Doniger's translation of Antigone, which was performed at the Court Theater, and she worked it out with David Green. They were both professors in social thought. She was also in divinity. So they got to see that. That's another translation. They got to see performance stills of Antigone. That's Ed Asner as Creon. But we have some other images of Antigone herself. My students were also able, thanks to a generous donor, able to see The Island over at Court Theater. The Island is a play that meditates on Antigone as performed by prisoners on Robben's Island in South Africa. And so students were able to go see the two-man show, speak with the performers, but then also have a talk back with Gabby Rendell-Bent, who's the Associate Artistic Director over there. This is also not out on the table, but it was important when thinking about the Declaration of Independence, for instance, to look at some of the legacies, right? Some of the ways in which that document was used to mobilize responses from and expansions and rights claims and so forth. And so this is a really wonderful, just teeny tiny a piece of ephemera. I don't know that there are any other copies of this particular leaflet that would have just been handed out to come to the White House to protest against the delay of women's suffrage in 1918. Maybe I'll just say one word about Martin Luther King's visit. We recently acquired into special collections the book of visiting ministers who spoke at Rockefeller Chapel. And one of the first things we did was to open it up and see if we could find Dr. Martin Luther King, and there was his signature. But King visited Chicago a number of times. My students, and we each had, the way I did this is students were, by choice, assigned to different teams. So there was a team that was interested in Plato, and there was a team that was interested in Homer and in Genesis and in Antigone and in the Declaration and in Martin Luther King. And I told the group that was doing King, Team King, that is, that I thought they would find the least things in our special collections because it was the newest thing, but also just because it takes time in some cases to get things into special collections. And I didn't think there was any meaningful association with Martin Luther King at the university. And they set out, because I had told them that, they set out to show me how wrong I was, which is great, the students here. And so they produced a comic book written in the wake of the Montgomery bus boycott that was designed for children, and that turns out to be incredibly rare. Like as rare as a 1570s version of Plato. It's just because these things were not kept, they don't survive. They found a telegram. They were like, what is a telegram? We found a telegram. A telegram from Martin Luther King to the widow of a divinity school professor who may have been assassinated at Ohio State in 1966. And they also found that King had spoken at Mandel Hall more or less in the week that he had moved to Chicago and moved to the west side of Chicago in 1966. To the Chicago Maroons' shame, they didn't send a photographer to Mandel Hall. We have no photographs of King addressing the students in Mandel Hall. He came as a guest of student government. And he talked about many things, largely economics, but he raised he invoked the Declaration of Independence, you can see there. And so it became a kind of a way of thinking about the lineage between some of the documents at the end of the syllabus. But one of the things they were most proud is that they had mined through the records of student government, finding not only the correspondence between student government, the president of student government, and Martin Luther King and his secretary at the time, negotiating all sorts of things about how long he would spend. Could they see his remarks before he gave them? No. Could they have his social security number so they could do the checks and all of this stuff? But then they found these flyers that were used to advertise his talk at Mandel Hall, which I think are just really remarkable survivals. You can see they're all stamped, but these are very ephemeral things. And even though this is much closer in time than the moment of the Berlin acquisition or Leo Strauss's time, we just know less about it. And I think that encouraged students to try to find out what they could. So I know we're running out of time, and I think I have just a little more to say to you. So I hope I've been able to convince you that our Humanities Core courses are not great books courses, though there are some great books on them. They're not places where you engage timeless questions or watch a great conversation unfurl, although at times certain course sequences have aspired to be just that. We don't teach liberty or Western tradition. Instead, we are there to help students develop interpretive skills, help them learn how to ask big questions, how to break those questions into other questions, how to approach writing about it. As our new president, Paul Alivisatos, has said over and over, Chicago is a place where you learn how to think and not what to think. And this has been as much of our operating practice with the College Core, which was developed in the context of a research university instead of in opposition to it. At Chicago, we sometimes engage in collective myths. All institutions do. One is of an unbroken tradition of the core, but that's not true. We like to think that the core is a tradition that dates back to the origins of the university in the 1890s, but that's not right. One version of the core dates to the 1930s, and these were survey courses, often big lecture courses in Mandel Hall, with faculty-led discussions or tutorials sometimes attached to them. Another core, a more modern one, dates to the 1960s, when the modern collegiate divisions were created. This new model of the college involved a common first year, where students took 4 year-long sequences in each division before moving on to their concentrations. Half of the curriculum at that time was in general education, but even still, there wasn't a common core. There were only variants. None of the cores our students now experienced existed in 1966. As far as I can tell, the oldest Hume cores still operating under the same name, Human Being and Citizen and Philosophical Perspectives, date to 1977, when tuition in the college was $3,720 a year, and President Alivisatos was a first-year student, beginning to learn how to think and not what to think. The core has, in fact, changed a great deal over the last 90 years, but it has always been a place for students to learn habits of mind, to learn how to ask questions, how to analyze texts, how to make and reconstruct arguments, and how to communicate with others, both in conversation and in writing. Helping students do all of that continues to be the biggest challenge of our humanities core. So thank you.